Well, today I get to teach you a little bit, and to get there, just need to do a little housekeeping first. I'm going to take us to talk about the N-word controversy in a little while, so I hope you're cool with that. And anybody have issues with nursing mothers? Great. All right, we'll be talking about that later as well. We're going to be taking a look at a small letter in the New Testament that almost got kicked to the curb because it didn't seem that relevant, and I'm going to show you that it just might be. I was fortunate enough 2 months ago to be on a truly epic trip that my parents took my wife and I on. You've heard me brag about it before, but let me just do it again. Took my brother and sisters and their spouses on, and it was a land and sea Alaska trip to celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary. It was awesome. And it was awesome because you start in Fairbanks and you learn about gold rush stuff, and that was really cool. And you do a little gold panning, and then you take a riverboat ride and you hear about indigenous people, and you get to see seaplanes take off and all that. And then you take a bus ride up to Denali, and you get to see the national park and ridiculous amounts of wildlife. I think we saw 12 or 14 grizzly bears, and it was just crazy. And then you take a beautiful train ride through the countryside, and you land in Anchorage, and then you catch a boat in Seward, and you get to see these crazy glaciers, and it's just a ridiculously amazing trip. Now, we could have taken that trip and just landed in all those places and seen all that stuff, and it would have been amazing because you can't not love what you're seeing. It just fills you up. However, there was something that made it particularly powerful for us. See, the way it works is the cruise ships themselves own every piece of the trip. So when you think cruise ship, you think water, but they actually own the land part too. So the whole thing is integrated, and what it means is they have the whole thing orchestrated so that every time you're doing something that there's anything noteworthy to note, they're letting you know about it. So it's constant helpful commentary from people who actually know what they're talking about every step of the way. And that's super helpful because if all we did was just drive around or look around, we'd see stuff, but now we really saw stuff that we didn't even know to look for. The commentary makes all the difference. The tour guides helped us figure out what to notice, and we did. Well, that's what I want to do with you today. You could read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and you'd be fine. You'd pick up some stuff on that. You can go to the next slide if you want, Gordon. You could figure out a lot. There's plenty to just read a surface reading on it, and you'd get a lot. But I'm absolutely certain that if you have a tour guide to help you along the way to notice things, you'll get a whole lot more. And that's my hope for you. Paul, in another letter, talks about one of the jobs of pastors is to equip the saints for every good work. And so my job is to equip you in the event that sometime in the near future you trip into a time machine and find yourself in 51 AD in the metropolis, the cosmopolitan city of Thessalonica. You will know how to behave. That is my goal for you today, to equip you for just such an occasion. So let's talk about Thessalonica. Let's go to the next slide, and first of all, we're going to talk about where is this. Now, I know everybody can make out that map super easy because it's so clear and big. So let me just walk you through a couple pieces here. So you're looking largely at a big chunk of Greece here. You have Athens down toward the bottom, Corinth to the left of that, Sparta, that Peloponnesia area. Oh, look at that, the red dot showed up. And up, thank you, Ted. And I don't know if you can make it out, but there's this sort of thick green line. It would look like a country border or something like that, the dotted line. Do you see that dark thing? That's actually called the Via Egnatia. And that was a major Roman road that allowed for a lot of commerce to happen. On the right-hand side, toward the edge of the map, there's a town called Philippi. Some call it Philippi. Paul wrote a letter to this church called the Philippians. He started a church there, the people of the Philippians, and it was an amazing church. It was probably Paul's favorite church. And then if you cruise left a little bit, just where there seems to be like a little harbor jotting up, that's Thessalonica. And so I want to kind of clue you in about where this is and why that matters. So culturally, you need to see, I mean, it's kind of obvious even from where you're sitting, you got two major things that are contributing to the livelihood of Thessalonica. you have that road, the Via Egnatia, which is a superhighway that connects Asia and the rest of the world, even all the way down. I mean, that's why the Romans were as successful as they were with their empire, as they built the infrastructure so that you could travel between places, and that's why commerce built around it. That's why the churches developed where they did, because you had systems to allow you to do that. But you also have a harbor there, which means the sea is open to you. So think San Francisco or think LA, because that's what we're talking about here. You have all kinds of cultural influences coming together. It was cosmopolitan. The world was at your fingertips, literally, by land or by sea. That's the feel of the place. Politically, it's part of the Roman Empire. In fact, Thessalonica is named after a former emperor's sister. So it's near and dear to the Roman people's heart, and you're not going to want to mess with it. So because it was such a key place, it was heavily guarded by the Roman Empire and heavily funded by the Roman Empire. That's very important, because you need to know that if something changes that would not be a good day in Thessalonica. I'm going to mess that up all day. Because you would, if you tick off Rome, they come with swords that you don't have. And they come with expertise, which you don't have. And they withdraw their money, which you don't have. And so it's trouble if you do that. In terms of political stuff in the theological context, you need to know this, that there are three major components that you'd have to be aware of if you land with your time machine in 51 AD in Thessalonica. First is you're in Greece, right? So what do you suppose would be a primary religion in that area? Not a terribly difficult question. Greek mythology, right? That's where it's born. So you can look for those relics, and actually even to this day, you can look on a map and look up, it's called now Thessaloniki, but you can look that up and do a little TripAdvisor on it, and they're going to talk about the Roman and Greek ruins that you can see to this day. It's pretty cool. So it'd be a pretty cool place to visit. So you have those Greek mythological influences, but it's Roman Empire. And there was a Roman mythology as well that was somewhat related to the Greek, but not exactly. And so you're going to have those places of worship, probably all over the place. And you're going to have people worshiping at those places of worship all the time. But then there's also one other important piece to know about worship in that city. And that is, you have to remember that to varying degrees, the emperor believed that they were divine incarnation. That they thought they were the very presence of God given to men and women. Domitian, toward the end of the 1st century, he was kind of off the charts with this. There's writings that we have of his where he demands to be called Lord and God. And when they would talk about salvation, they were the ones that coined it before the church stole it and made it ours. Because they thought they were the purveyors of salvation. They were the first world evangelists because they thought they had the good news. And the good news is the Roman Empire has your back. And all you got to do is worship the top, who happened to be the emperor, who in some cases were really crazy. I like Domitian. So you know that part of the cultural, theological context that you're in is a spirituality that is informed by Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and probably most importantly, you make sure you know who to worship at the top, who would be the emperor. You with me so far? Okay, so let's talk about how Paul got there, because Paul got there kind of on the run. So he was in Philippi, and he was doing this great ministry with the help of a woman named Lydia. And she was wealthy. If you know the story, I've preached on it a bunch of times over all the years, but she was a purveyor of purple and fine linen. That meant that she sold to royalty and extremely wealthy people, because purple was a tough color of dye to get your hands on. She was loaded, and she had a big house in Philippi, and that's where the first church met. Now, a lot of scholars believe that after Paul left, Lydia was actually functioning as the pastor of that church, with the full authority and blessing of Paul. Now that's pretty awesome, because that means a woman in 51 AD or so had that kind of authority, which is incredible. It wouldn't be incredible in a Greek context. She was already successful and looked at as such. But just keep that in mind. So anyway, things are going along great in this house church, and people are coming to know what's going on. And then one day, something went south for Paul. He's trucking around the streets, and there's this slave girl who's, the story goes, is possessed by a demon of some sort that gives her the power to tell people's fortunes. And that's how she's making her slave owner money, is people would pay to have this little girl, this young woman, tell their fortune. And apparently it was convincing enough that they believed it, and she was pretty successful at it. Well, if we just roll along with it, the way the story goes is when this girl would see Paul, this thing inside of her would cause her to blurt out, well, that guy is a servant of the Most High God, and he's here to tell you some really good news. Well, that totally blew all his hopes of playing it low-key, and it's bad for business, you know what I mean? And so after a while of this, Paul was frustrated. And so he just looked at her and kind of did a prayer out loud and said, God, I don't know what's going on with her, but I ask that you just heal this thing up. Meaning, get rid of the demon, whatever that thing is, within her. And you know what happened? It did. It went away. And as soon as it went away, so did her capacity to tell fortunes. And as soon as that went away, so did her capacity to make her slave owner a fortune. Money talks, people. And so money talked loudly to that guy. He was ticked off. He went to the magistrates, made up some stuff about Paul's trying to spread some heresy, blah, blah, blah. The magistrates believe it. Why wouldn't they? And long story short, Paul and Silas and Timothy, they get the snot beat out of them and get thrown into prison. That night, an earthquake happens, shakes all the doors open. The jailer is sure everybody has run out, namely Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and is about to kill himself because he knows if any prisoners escape, it's going to be his head the next day. And Paul knows this is going on, so he says, stop, wait, we're still here. And the jailer, making sure they don't go away, takes them into his own home, where he asks Paul about this hope that he has. And that night, the jailkeeper and his family and his servants choose to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Pretty wild stuff. The next morning, the jailkeeper takes them back, shows that they did not escape to the magistrates. And at that point, Paul decides to pull out his trump card. I'm a Roman citizen. Now that freaked them right out, because there's due process involved with Roman citizens, which they did not follow. So the magistrates knew that they fouled here. But rather than take them back in, knowing that they were catalytic people, that they were going to cause more and more problems in Philippi, they asked them to leave. So beaten and bruised, they walk. And they get on that road, and they go all the way to Thessalonica. And why? Because that's the next smartest place to be. And what does Paul do? Back to work. I'm going to tell people about the hope that I have. Any chance I can get to do that. That's my job. So he does. And he tells about the good news, and the people in Thessalonica, they hear the good news, they respond to the good news, they look at the different theologies that they'd been born and raised with, and then they heard what had happened to Paul. They heard about this guy named Jesus, and what he was talking about God, and all these things that kind of bring it all together, and the Spirit of God's working in them, and so they choose to say yes and follow Jesus as well, and a church is born. And then problems arise. Have you ever bought something only to find out that there's fine print about the real costs of that thing later on? It could be a car. So my son, I helped him co-sign with him on a car a couple years ago. He's making the payments, but I'm helping him get some credit built and all that stuff. And so we settle on the purchase price, and then when we're doing the financing stuff, he's looking at the contract, and first he notices something that he hadn't really considered before. There's this thing called tax. Have you heard of that? Oh my gosh. On a car, that's a big number. And then, on his iPhone, he's figuring out, okay, so many dollars we're paying for that car, and then we're going to make, I don't know if it's 48 or 60 payments, something like that. So he does that, and he knows what the number is going to be. And then he looks on that contract, on the finance agreement, and it's not the same number. Can you believe that? Because there's this little thing called interest and finance charge. And I've only started to tell him because I'm going to cover his insurance for a while, but isn't that going to be a lovely surprise for a young adult male, right? That's going to be a really bad awakening. I'm going to let him pay the car off first, then he's going to realize he's still paying for the car with his insurance payment. So that day's to come. So that's coming for him. Those are hidden costs that you don't quite know are there until you're into it. Or if you're a homeowner, you buy the house, even if you buy a new house, you're not done paying for that house. There's going to be stuff you got to buy. There's going to be repairs. There's always more costs involved that you just don't know about at first. Or another analogy. If you've ever been fallen in love with somebody, or maybe you're a junkie maybe you fall in love with a football team or something like that, and you devote all this time to your beloved, be it a person or a team or your sport or your hobby or whatever, and you're so into this thing, and all of your time is with this person or this hobby or team or whatever, that you start to realize over time there is a cost that's coming by you being so devoted to your true love. And that cost often comes in the form of faded relationships. So I know this was true when Lynn and I met. We fell in love fast. We were engaged 6 months after our first date, after we met, really, because we knew it was right. And so far, so good, after 25 years. So I think we're going to make it. But I was so enamored with her, I didn't really give a rip about any of my college friends. And so after a while, they just kind of expected not to see me anymore. And they were right, because I was always hanging out with Lynn. And she didn't go to our college. She'd already graduated college, so I was always hanging out with her where she was. That happens all the time, doesn't it? Even with family. I remember when Lynn introduced me to Jenny, her sister, and they're very close. And Jenny took one look at me and just shook her head and started to sob. And I don't know why that was exactly. Could be a range of reasons. But I do believe, because she said as much, that part of the reason why she was sad is because she knew that when Lynn and I were heading toward engagement and marriage, she knew that was going to impact her relationship with her sister. And there was going to be a loss there. And that's right. So we have unexpected costs, like when you buy a car or a house. You have unintended things that happen, consequences, when you fall in love with somebody. Or to really help my mind get into this, what was going on in Thessalonica, a couple weeks ago, Lynn and I had the opportunity to go with a couple of friends to a Raiders game. Any Raiders fans out there? Yes. All right. Hey, let's just add her to the prayer list. Joan Andrews. And Beth, apparently, as well. Well, here's the thing. I mean, that's an impressive stadium, and they are one of the loudest teams in football, to be sure. However, I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and my wife was born in Emporia, Kansas, 2 hours to the south. She and I, at our core, are Kansas City Chiefs fans. And the reason we went to that game is because they were playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who are one of their biggest rivals. And of course, we dressed in our Chiefs garb, because that's what you do. And going in, there are a lot of words that come to mind when you think about Raiders. You think about classy, genteel, subtle, sensitive, Man, we were in trouble. We had family back in KC that were worried for our lives, and perhaps they needed to be. Even at tailgating, people are giving us a hard time as they're walking by. All we're doing is eating a sandwich, but nope, they got to throw some trash our way. We go to get through security line, and we're just minding our own business, man. We know, we're like 4 of 50, people wearing red in that whole stadium, we're standing out. And there's this poor guy, like, 2 lines away, just minding his own business, trying to get through security, wearing an ugly Christmas sweater, but it's a Chiefs ugly Christmas sweater. Thought, wow, that guy's got some guts, man. And there was this caring, sensitive Raiders fan right behind him. I mean, like, if this was the Chiefs fan, this guy was right here. I have never heard such a creative string of F-bombs placed together in short order as he was throwing into that guy's ear at full volume. And that poor guy was just sitting there taking it, like, And even the guy who was talking like this, yelling at the top of his lungs, at one point, he points over to us 2 lines away, and he's like, why aren't you behaving more like those people? We're like, man, leave us out of this. You know? Well, the crazy thing is there was not one person that thought that was odd behavior near the Colosseum. Apparently, that's just normal Raider talk. As soon as we got into our place in the stands, we were met with a welcoming boo from everybody in that section. I can't believe that any drink I bought between quarters had anything left in them because I was absolutely certain that those things would be all over my front because of all those loving Raider fans in that building. Even at the very end of the game, after they barely won, mind you, it was a fantastic game, even though Chiefs lost. Even though they barely won, and even though the Chiefs are still the best team in football currently, and probably will be, at least in terms of statistics, still everybody was chanting on the way out. Something about Kansas City Chiefs, I think the first word they said something about duck or something like that, and we're not happy about our Kansas City Chiefs for some reason, even though they just won the game. So that's the environment, and I want to tell you, when you are 1 or 4 of 50 people in a massive stadium that is completely sold out and is getting up to 124 decibels of screaming against the Kansas City Chiefs and their fans, you know you are standing out. You are easy to spot and fun to pick on. That's a Christian in Thessalonica. They stood out. They stood out because they recognized that they were no longer cheering for the same teams. They were cheering for this God that they were discovering was so experienced and taught by Jesus, and so powerfully experienced by Paul, and so convincingly. They chose to follow that God, and when they did, there were consequences that they didn't expect. There was fine print. There were hidden costs. They were no longer going to these other places of worship and all the activities that would be surrounding those things. So they weren't rubbing shoulders with the same people, which meant they didn't have the same networking as they did before. They didn't get the same favors as before because now they're Chiefs fans at the Colosseum. And they're no longer looked at the same. And they're treated differently. And they knew it. If you read both of these letters, you're going to see that these people are struggling, wondering, what do we do when we're a Chiefs fan and the Raiders Coliseum? How do we behave? We're dying here. I don't know if we can make it anymore. And so Paul gives them advice, and one of the things he says repeatedly is, hey, just remember your hope. Remember where this whole thing's headed. God is with you. God is going to gather you into his own. There's going to come a day when you are going to be welcomed home. It's going to be all right. You found this one true God. Don't give up on that. But then along the way, he also offered some helpful advice. And that shows up in the next slide. So Paul says this to them. You yourselves know, dear brothers, and by telling about himself, just a heads up, he's describing himself, and by doing so, he's saying, pay attention to what we did because that's what I want you to do. Look at what I did and imitate it. You yourselves know, dear brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not a failure. You know how badly we had been treated at Philippi just before we came to you and how much we suffered there. Yet our God gave us the courage to declare his good news to you boldly, in spite of great opposition. So you can see we were not preaching with any deceit or impure motives or trickery. On the next slide. For we speak as messengers approved by God to be entrusted with the good news. Our purpose is to please God, not people. He alone examines the motives of our hearts. Never once did we try to win you with flattery, as you well know. And God is our witness that we were not pretending to be your friends just to get your money. As for human praise, we have never sought it from you or anyone else. And the next slide. As apostles of Christ, we certainly had a right to make some demands of you, but instead we were like children among you. Or we were like a mother feeding and caring for her own children. We loved you so much that we shared with you not only God's good news, but our own lives too. So before we get to the nursing mother, let's talk about that N-word. Probably not the N-word you're thinking of, unless you happen to be thinking about the word nepioi. Nepioi is a Greek word. Now the interesting thing about this word nepioi is that it actually caused controversy among biblical translators. And if you go to almost every contemporary translation except two, the New International Version and the New Living Translation, which is what you're looking at here, they're going to give you a different verse here. They are going to just say this to you. As apostles of Christ, we certainly had a right to make some demands of you, but we were like a mother feeding and caring for her own children. They're going to skip that whole infant thing altogether, because the word they're looking at is epioi. And epioi means basically a nursing mother. But some of the ancient manuscripts put an N before epioi, making it nepioi. Nepioi means infant. And so just two translations, in at least our modern collection, decided just to give it both to us, which I think was really wise. Because it means that the ancients before us wanted us to see both things. What is Paul saying here? Well, first he's saying, we came among you as infants. Now I know what you're thinking. When you think of infants, you think of warrior, you think of people of destruction, unless we're talking about diapers. No. When we're thinking about infants, we're thinking completely vulnerable. Like, I completely need you to survive. I can't live, literally, without your help. That's the attitude that Paul came with. Humility, not, I have the answers, let me tell you all about it. Not with any kind of braggadociousness, not with any kind of a puffed up chestness, but as an infant. And the tone that Paul had was that of a breastfeeding mother. Now there's an element of vulnerability here for sure. Breastfeeding mothers generally are not well equipped at that particular moment to protect themselves. They are busy nurturing their child. But he says the tone I want you to have, first, your posture is as an infant, one who is vulnerable, one who understands you need the help of others, so you're in humility here. But then the tone that you have is one of nurturing a child, not beating them over the head with your truth, not beating them over the head because you're sure you're right, but trying to nurture the best out of the people that you're dealing with. You see the shift in tone there? Because I'm certain that there were Raider fans screaming into the ears of these chief fan Christians in that day, letting them know how stupid they were, how off they were. And normal human nature is to say, oh yeah, and get into it. But Paul is saying, no, it's not your posture as a Jesus follower. Your posture is as an infant. Your posture is to be as a mother nursing her baby. You are after the betterment of the one that you're with. Nurture that. Well, all right. So, I think my work here is done. If you happen to find yourself in that time machine back in 51 AD, and you fall into Thessalonica, you know exactly how to behave. You are welcome. But wait, there's more. So, Lauren Haas is our chief comic collector and procurer here at the church, and he had a whopper this week, which actually is a great fit. So on the next slide, you get this little comic, and I don't know if you read it on Facebook, but let me just walk it through. So this is called Coffee with Jesus, and so you have your priest, pastor-y looking dude over there, and he's having a conversation with Jesus, and my eyes are too old to look at that, so let's look at this one. It says, so I think I've got a good analogy for the kingdom of God for this Sunday's sermon, Jesus. A river. And Jesus responds, it's been so many times, Joe. It's obvious. The current is the will of God. Don't swim upstream, etc. You know, I'd go with a swimming pool. And the pastor says, okay. Any hints on how to elaborate? And Jesus says, the kingdom of God is like unto a swimming pool. And most of you are splashing around in the shallow end. Bam. Yeah, that's right. Let that sink in a moment. What could he possibly mean by that? Well, I think the people in Thessalonica, I don't think they had to wonder about that. I don't think they had to wonder about the shallow end. They didn't have to worry about that, because for them to just utter Christ, to make the statement, I'm no longer a part of that, automatically put them into the deep end. Because it immediately, just that statement, in a cultural context where there were so many other religions being practiced so passionately, for them to stand as four in a stadium of 50,000 or however many people were in this arena called Thessalonica, that was throwing yourself in the deep end. But I think we don't quite get that in our culture for all kinds of reasons. For one reason, I think because somehow we've told ourselves that because part of our nation's beginning came from a desire for religious freedom, and so that started part of it, but so did at the same time in Jamestown, so did a quest for gold. And these two things, seeking religious freedom in the north and seeking gold in Jamestown to the south, these two things kind of combined together. But since they were all coming from an inherently Christian-esque place, a new Christian empire, so to speak, respectively, we sort of told ourselves that our nation must certainly therefore be a Christian nation. And if we're here, we're already kind of in the game. There aren't any other real religions going on in the United States. There are a few here and there, but Christianity is the primary religion that is given assent to this day across the nation. Even though the rise of the nuns is a real thing where people aren't affiliating with any religious tradition, still, the vernacular for most people has Christianity all over it. Or at least medieval Christianity written all over it, which focus primarily on, do I have the religion right? Am I doing it right? Am I believing it right? Do I have the correct religion? Which is important. But I'm afraid that maybe because we have a quote-unquote Christian nation and we think so, that maybe we've kind of, one, missed what worship is all about because we think it's just showing up on Sunday at church. And two, not even recognizing all of the other gods that are being worshipped right under our nose all around us. Perhaps, this is where the shallow end would come in, perhaps unwittingly, even as we profess Christ in this setting, in 20 minutes, or in an hour if you're staying for chili, and you move out, you may just find yourself unwittingly worshiping other gods. I think that's what Jesus is getting at about the shallow end. The gods that I think are most prevalent around us in our culture, they don't have shrines in the specific sense. You're not going to find an altar. You're not going to find a stage necessarily like this. You're not going to find formal offering plates or formal prayers, so to speak. But there are plenty of gods being worshipped all around us all the time that beg for your allegiance. Ultimately, the primary competitor to our allegiance with God is a desire for ourselves, a desire that we would be God, that it's all about us. That is our primary goal. That was the tension in the Garden of Eden, is thinking we could get by on our own, and so not listening to the wisdom of God and find ourselves in big trouble. That's always at the core of everything, but it manifests itself in all kinds of different ways. All kinds of different ways and expressions of worship that I wonder if we find ourselves in, unbeknownst to us, and we would never write it out that we are worshiping these things, but maybe we actually do. So let's talk about one of those gods, and then we'll talk about another. Let's talk about materialism. Materialism is a worshipful art in the United States that really was born out of brilliant marketing in the 1940s, when they first started to think about the idea of marketing things not because somebody needed a thing, But because they figured out that if they marketed it right, you could actually get somebody to want a thing they didn't really need. And it really did have a starting point. If you look at ads before this time, the ads were as boring as all get out. Here's a pitchfork. It pitches stuff. $5, whatever. You fast forward 10 years after that, let me tell you about this pitchfork. That pitchfork you have, that stinks. This has an ergonomic handle. This has a new titanium alloy fork on the end of that handle. We even put some rods in the middle of the wood so that it actually flexes a little bit so that your back never quite tires out. It has this funny angle on it, which people are going to look at you funny at first, but then you're going to be envy of the whole block because you have a new pitchfork that nobody else has. That's what I'm talking about, and it changed, and it's still with us. And I'm guilty at times because I have upgraded my phone, which was working just fine, to get the new phone, which I absolutely must have, right? To do all the apps that I must use. So I wonder if sometimes we find ourselves worshiping the God of materialism unbeknownst to us, just because we haven't thought about it. We haven't wondered if I am saying that I am giving my allegiance to the God that I have understood in Jesus, the God who I am made in the image of, and I understand that I am fully loved by this God, and I'm called to live in response to that reality, that I am loved deeply by God, which is going to inform all of my steps, all of my decisions. I wonder if we've ever asked the question, what does it mean to respond to the material needs that I have from a Jesus framework, or from a made in God's image framework? Because if we haven't, it doesn't mean we are worshiping these other gods, but I bet there's a lot better chance that we are, because we haven't thought it through. So an example, person that I know announced on Facebook they were moving into a new house, and they were debating. And these are Christian people, deeply devoted Christian people, and she was putting this post on Facebook to kind of celebrate God's faithfulness and their faithfulness, kind of all at the same time. It was a little bit of a pat on the back to themselves as they were patting God's back. And here's the thing. So they're moving into this new house, and they wanted to buy a new TV. And the problem with that is their old TV was just fine. It just wasn't going to quite fit the wall right. It's like their 50-inch TV was going to work okay. Oh, baby, that 60-inch TV. Now we're talking, right? And they're sports fans, so they're weighing it out, and they're thinking, how can we afford this? It's really not in our budget. We've got to come up with this, $800, $900, whatever it was, for this dream TV that they had. And so they started to wonder where they could get the money. And they entertained the idea of, well, what about the money we normally give to our church? They call it tithe because they grew up in church. Should we give the money that we would normally give to church, just for, a little bit, so we can get that sweet TV as we move into the new house? And they decided not to. The very next day, this is very exciting, the very next day, her husband goes to Best Buy, and by some crazy chance, he is the 1,000th customer or whatever it is in this promotion. He wins. What does he win? The TV! Hey! And so this friend of mine is talking about how good God is. That because they honored their tithe, that God provided them with a brand new TV that they didn't need. And I thought, yeah, amen. Thank you, Lauren. I'm actually speaking about Lauren and Lisa here. Hope that's okay. No, I'm not. So I'm wondering, that's a cool thing. That's a cool thing that he won the TV. But I wonder if a more Jesus framework might engage it like this. First of all, come to the same question, saying, yeah, we're not going to give up supporting this thing that we love that is informing us and changing the world. That would be silly. So maybe a better Jesus response is, okay, so we're gonna sock away $100 a month for the next 9 months, and then we'll go buy the TV and maybe hit a sale. That sounds like a good, reasonable Jesus kind of approach. I'm going to worship God. I'm not going to get suckered into the moment and the heat of the moment, so I got to get my TV. There's always going to be a next sale. We'll wait. I think that would be a very plausible, good Jesus response. But then what about when he gets the new TV? Maybe a plausible Jesus response to that would be not just, oh, God is good for honoring me because I've been so faithful, which is, anyway. But maybe the better response would be, gosh, we didn't see this coming, but we were planning on carving out $100 a month for the next 9 months so we could buy this same TV. We were planning on carving it out anyway. Why don't we think about what good we could do in the world with that $100 for the next 9 months as a way, as almost a thank you offering? Now that to me sounds like a different way to engage materialism, where you are not sucked into the machine, but you're thoughtful and you're asking the question, how has God made me? Who has God called me to be? What really matters in my life? What am I going to do with my resources? Or I wonder about relationship dynamics. We live in a culture that has become increasingly binary, meaning rights and wrongs, blacks and whites, and especially along political lines. And both sides of the aisle use rhetoric that is destructive and hurtful. No infants here. No nursing mothers here. And I think that bleeds right into the way we treat each other in the general public, doesn't it? So somebody comes at us with harsh words, our normal natural reaction is to come right back with harsh words. Somebody takes a swing at us, it's just an opportunity for us to justify a swing right back at them. That is the way the world works. And to worship the God of retaliation in that way is to follow suit. So we deem that a worthy response. So we worship. That's what worship means, is worthiness or worthwhileness. So we worship the God of retaliation when we choose to, with our fists and with our attitude, with our shouts, to pay homage to that God by lashing out, by taking the swing, by raising our voices. But that's not the way Jesus did it, is it? Because Jesus knew exactly who he was, where he was going, had more God going on with him than we've ever seen. And his response, even when he was wronged, when he was treated with injustice, his response was to be quiet. His response was to carry the cross that others put on him and hang on it until he died. And as he was dying, say, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Now that's a different kind of response. That to me sounds like an infant. That to me sounds like a nursing mother trying to nurture the people and the relationships around them rather than create bigger dividing walls. Which God are you worshiping? The God of retribution and retaliation, or the God that we see in Jesus and in Paul? I mean, we could make a big long list of, we could talk about sexuality. How do you think about sexuality? In terms of what you're viewing, what you're doing, how you're figuring all that out. Is it just, hey, it's just the way it is? Is it just the way the culture is? Or is your sexuality, the way you think about it, oriented toward, I am made in the image of God, worthy of respect, and so is this other person that I'm engaging with? That changes everything. There's no objectifying in that kind of a framework because you deeply value the other. There's no potential for rape, which is really more about power than it is sexuality, but it's a sexual act nonetheless. There's no room for that because as the person who's thinking about that, you're thinking, this is a person who is just as much created in the image of God as I am, and therefore I must treat this person with dignity and respect. That's a whole different frame of reference. The fact is, you and I are tempted to worship in myriad ways in our culture because myriad other gods are worshipped in our culture. My question for you is, are you in the deep end or the shallow end? Have you even wondered, have you even asked the question, how is what I'm doing in all of these other sectors an expression of worship in my life? Because they are. Because they are. Crosswalk, the campus, was incredibly worshipful for 2 weeks straight. I mean, we're pretty worshipful all the time, I think. I'm very proud of our church. But for 2 weeks, this place sang the praises of God. And you know how it did it? Right here. this sacred space became true sanctuary for people who are running for their lives. That's worship. Better than we can ever sing. Even though I love how Brian sings, and Linda sings, and Jennifer sings, that's a better worship. And that's a beautiful thing. You get to worship all of your life. And sometimes you get to sing. But everything you do is a moment for you to decide, what am I really about? Who am I really for? So final slide, just some questions just to tick you off for the rest of the day. So we are surrounded by people who worship lots of other gods. What are those gods they give themselves to? Have you ever thought about that? We are called to worship, proclaim worthwhileness or worthiness of the God we know in Jesus. So how are our lives proclaiming God's worthwhileness? How are you in your daily living and your decisions? How is that reflecting your decision that God is worthy of your honor and respect? Or have we settled for the shallow end and only professed with our lips while everything else does not reflect what we say we value as Jesus followers? Heavy duty stuff. Heavy duty stuff. And now, I am truly finished. Let's pray together. So God, holy God, God who is our ground of being, God who continues to create at speeds we can't fathom as the universe continues to expand. God whose complexity is beyond our ability to imagine. God who has come down to us, who has come alongside of us, come in us. We see you. We believe you. We put our faith in you. Above all other gods, whether they're called gods or not, whether they have written theologies about them or not, we choose you above all else. And in so doing, it means that we ask difficult but such life-giving questions about everything we do. And I pray that you will remind us to do so, because you are worthy of our worship. We are created in your image, and we are so humbled that you would value us thusly. May we show our gratitude and our response in the way that we choose to live. In Jesus' name, amen.